welcome to The Kill File, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany, and each week we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown, because in The Kill File, nothing stays buried forever. Hey guys, welcome to the third episode of The Kill File. I am so glad you're back. Today we are going to be talking about a man named, I'm going to butcher this, so bear with me, Gennady Modestovich Mikhasevich. And there's a few trigger warnings before we get started. Guys, today is going to be brutal. There's going to be talk about murder, rape, and all over just nastiness, so be aware. All right, we're just going to jump right into it. Gennady Modestovich Mikhasevich, he's going to go by Gennady from now on, was born on April 7th, 1947 in Vitebsk Oblast. These are hard words to say, so if I am butchering them, I apologize. Byelorussian SSR Soviet Union. So on a side note about this man, I tried to find out as much as I could about his childhood, but apparently the reason that there isn't as much information about him is because up until right after his execution, his story wasn't known or released to Western media. But I'm going to share with you guys everything that I could find. It said that his father was a raging alcoholic and abusive towards him and his mother. Because of how his father's behavior was, he was bullied in school. In turn, he became quiet, kept to himself, but he was said to be smart. Sources said that because he was sullen and withdrawn, he didn't do very well socially and had very little social interaction. Therefore, he didn't have much success with girls during his teen years. Apparently, some of the girls ridiculed him, which just ended up giving him a negative emotional perception of sex. I'm guessing that this is just my opinion, but knowing where this is leading, that his childhood with his father, the lack of social interaction, and problems with girls, that it all played into his crimes later. Not that his childhood is an excuse for any of the crimes that he committed or anything, but I'm always just interested in why people are the way that they are. Like, what makes people do the things they do, especially when it comes to just such extremes. So I find their backstory interesting. So it was said that Gennady was in a relationship with a young woman named Elena, but unfortunately it was cut short because Gennady got drafted into the military. When Gennady returned a year later, discharged due to hepatitis, he returned to his village and he was met with the news that his girlfriend had not only already moved on, but that she was married. Heartbroken and distraught, Gennady decided to catch a bus back to where his parents lived. On the evening of May 14th, 1971, Gennady missed the bus that was supposed to take him to his parents and said it was too late to catch another bus. In this moment, feeling desolate because of his breakup with really what was his only girlfriend, he decided that he was going to hang himself. He prepared a loop to hang himself when, by chance, he was walking and met a 19-year-old young woman named Ludmila Andaralova. Ludmila was a local girl that was on her way home from a vacation where she ran into Gennady. Gennady then decided to take his anger and his fit of rage out on this young woman instead. He then proceeded to rape her and then strangle her with his bare hands. After this, he tied Ludmila's hands with a clothesline and then hid the body in a garden nearby and fled the scene. So this was his first murder. I'm not sure why he would tie her hands after he assaulted her, so I'm not sure if that was written wrong or the source said it the other way around, but it was after this first murder that Gennady realized that killing women was appalling yet effective for a pain reliever for his depression. It was said that he got particular enjoyment when his victims would attempt to struggle or scratch him. He said, quote, "Why should I throttle myself because of a woman? Better throttle some woman myself." Which is, it's so gross knowing that he enjoyed the struggle that it just makes me super angry. What a douche. This is a side note, but I feel like it needs to be said. I first heard on a fellow woman's true crime YouTube video, and I think it's my duty to spread the awareness and push this along to anyone that's listening. If you ever find yourself in a situation that you realize that unfortunately you may not make it out of, I hope that this doesn't happen to any of us by any means, not even my worst enemy. But, if it were to ever happen to you, scratch the crap out of that guy. dig your nails, do whatever you have to do to get your attacker or potentially your killer's DNA under your nails and get as much as you can so that there will be evidence for the police to use. Okay, so after Gennady's first murder, he followed his first act with a long series of sexual assaults and murders by some known to locals as the Strangler of Vitebsk. I'm sure I'm not saying that right. I apologize if I'm butchering this. It is said that none of Gennady's murders were planned in advance. He would straight up drive around in his little red compact car called a Zaporowitz and find women he liked the look of, which this is scary as hell to me, to think that you could just be walking along, minding your own business, and someone's looking at you and they're thinking, ooh, I like the way you look. I think I want to murder you. That's just terrifying, and I hope that that doesn't happen to any of us. Don't talk to strangers. He would then offer rides to the women, to which he stated that all of the women accepted the rides. I know this is just my opinion, but if someone offers you a ride, don't do it. Don't get in. It's not worth your life. I can't tell you how many stories I've heard where people have gotten into somebody else's car and was just flat out never heard from again. Even if they're nice, even if they're handsome, even if they're polite, even if it's a woman. Do not get in the vehicle. Call somebody, walk, do whatever you have to do. Don't get in. Again, that's just my opinion, but it's good advice, so take it. So after he got them in the car, he would then drive to an isolated area. He would remove a scarf, and then he would strangle his victims with it. He said that he would either strangle or smother the victims in locations that he thought to be quiet and isolated. It was said that once he actually went into a nightclub and he had hopes to meet a new girlfriend, like a new love interest. Terrifying, you know? Anyways, he actually met a woman and she had suggested that they could spend the night together. Well, I guess it didn't go that well for him because she eventually realized that he was not experienced sexually and she made the detrimental mistake of mocking him, which, not victim blaming, this is just how it was reported. Of course, this triggered him and he ended up choking her to death, which is so sad. Nobody deserves that. There is said to be only one known survivor of his from October 1971. While attempting to strangle a young woman, she was actually able to put her hand inside the noose, which prevented Gennady from being able to tighten it any further. She then bit his hand and started screaming like hell. This alerted some students that were walking by, and it scared Gennady off. Good for her. Hell yes, I love to hear it. She foiled his attack plan. You go, girl. Gennady stated that to his own surprise, he was unable to strangle the same victim twice. Which is just sick. But what he meant by that was when one of the women that he choked had regained consciousness, he said he found himself not able to strangle her a second time. So I was curious, is this because he was tired? Is it because he felt bad? He probably didn't feel bad. I mean, he is a serial killer, but why couldn't he do it twice? Like, did he feel like she survived, so maybe she didn't deserve to die? Or was it literally just like, it takes so long to, strangle somebody in the first place that he just didn't have the energy to do it again? I don't know. So apparently for this victim, after she woke up, he instead grabbed a pair of scissors from the woman's handbag. Oh, this is going back to the woman who he strangled and she regained consciousness. So apparently for this victim, after she woke up, he instead grabbed a pair of scissors from the woman's handbag and stabbed her to death. So Gennady never actually walked around or drove around with any kind of weapons. He said that he would just improvise ways to kill his victims, and some of the weapons or tools that he would use were actually deemed exotic. And I was like, well, what does that mean? For example, this one was weird. So he once used a cord that was made of rye. Like, I think it meant like rye the bread. Like, how do you do that? I don't know. Maybe I must not know what rye looks like. I'm not a huge like rye bread person. Maybe you are. I don't know. It was interesting. So if you have any comments on that, reach out on the socials because I want to know what that would look like. It said that Gennady didn't stop with rape and murder, but that he would also rob them of their money and their valuable items. He would steal things of ordinary substance as well, like scissors and stuff, which to me is super weird. Why would you steal regular stuff? Was he just like, oh, I just brutally, raped and murdered this victim, but oh, they have nice scissors and I needed a pair of those. Like, who does that? Whatever, he's just such a weirdo. So it said that some of the valuable items that he would later regift to his wife, which is disgusting. And if I ever found out that my husband not only gifted me something that used to be somebody else's, but someone who he actually assaulted and murdered, I would first off be so pissed because, oh my God, that is disgusting and how gross. And I don't even think that I would be okay after that. Like, if that woman found out, I wonder what her thoughts were. That's just, can you imagine? Like, oh, this bracelet that you thought your husband went and picked out is actually from a victim that he raped and murdered. It's awful. It just makes it so much worse, too. The worst thing that I read, though, oh, this is awful. Okay, the worst thing that I read was that he did with one of his victims' valuables was that he actually took 2 of the women's wedding rings, he melted it down, and he used them to make dental fillings and crowns for his wife. What in the actual fuck is wrong with this guy? Oh my God. The horror of finding out what is in your mouth. I can't even imagine. So in 1976, Gennady ended up getting a job as a locksmith. He ended up getting married and he had 2 children. I wonder what his wife was like. I am so interested to know what she was like. I couldn't find enough information about this case. I did the best I could, but I'm hoping that there might be somebody out there that already knows this case or knows a little bit more, and you can jump on our socials or even head over to the website and email me. I'm super curious if you have any information on him. On the outside, Gennady seemed to be a wholesome family man, a conscientious worker, and just an all-around regular guy. But we know better here on the Kill File, don't we? It's said that he was a member of the Communist Party. He served as a local party functionary, which helped to increase his social standing and warded off any potential accusations. So he wanted to look good to everyone around him so they would never suspect him. And it worked for him, unfortunately. He was also, this was interesting. He was also said to be a teetotaler. I've never in my life heard that word. I had no idea what it was, so I had to do a little research, and it turns out that it's just a fancy-ass way of saying he was not a drinker. So he did not partake in the alcohol. He was also a member of the Voluntary People's Druzina. I know I'm butchering this, I'm so sorry. Which is basically equivalent to the American Neighborhood Watch, which most of us are probably familiar with. In the 1980s, when this case finally started to advance, it took police over a decade to even start to connect the killings. The investigator, I'm going to butcher this again, here we go, Gennadovich, was convinced that the killings of women near the expressways were not separate instances, but rather the workings of a serial killer. And he was right. It was around this time that the authorities were starting to figure out that the killer was using a red compact car. It's a brand. I can't say it. I'm sorry. It's super confusing. Zaporozhets, using a red Zaporozhets, which I know I butchered, and has started searching for anyone who drove this type of car in the oblast, aka in the province, because I didn't know what an oblast was. Hopefully you guys are smarter than me, but if you're not, don't feel bad because I didn't know either. Gennady was actually a volunteer police officer. Get this. Gennady was actually a volunteer police officer and was part of the searches and investigations of the killer, so he was basically searching for himself. It went as far as to say that he would pull people over who drove the same car as him and would actually interview people for the crimes that he himself had committed. What a freak. I wonder if this had him feeling all sorts of confidence, that if the authorities were so far off from solving these that he was actually able to help on the cases, he probably thought he was never going to get caught. Ugh. So it's said that even after the police figured out that these were connected, they focused so much on reporting to their own bosses that they had solved these murders that they weren't even actually solving them. Because of this, 14 innocent people were prosecuted for the Strangler's crimes, which we will get into later, but 14 innocent, I don't know if they're innocent, but 14 different people. Even Gennady was growing worried for himself and was afraid of being caught, which is when he made one big fatal mistake. He decided that he was going to try and derail the investigation of his crimes, and since he was on the inside, he decided that it would be a good idea to send an anonymous letter to the local newspaper. In this letter, he introduced himself to the world as being a part of an underground organization called the Patriots of Vitebsk. I'm sorry I'm saying that wrong. He made it seem like this group of patriots were men whose wives had cheated on them, that had vowed to take revenge on all women. He pretended to call onto his fellow organizational members to essentially up their game of killing communists and lewd women. And in case you don't know what the word lewd means, because to be honest, I've heard this word my entire life and I knew it out of context. I was pretty sure I knew what it meant, but I wanted to know exactly what it meant so I could tell anybody out there who didn't know this is what it means. Quote, crude and offensive in a sexual way. So, he also made sure to include in this letter some anti-Soviet passages in hopes of getting the attention of the KGB. It's said that the authorities thought the first letter that had been sent in was some kind of sick joke. They didn't think it was real at all. After this, Gennady left a handwritten note in the mouth of his newest victim, and he signed it on behalf of Patriots of Vitebsk. The note said, quote, death to the unfaithful. Fight the coppers and communists, end quote. Apparently, this was enough for the authorities to conclude that the first letter and the note were both written by the same person. And furthermore, they figured out his blood type because of the saliva on the envelope. It is just the smallest thing that happens sometimes to catch people, and it just fascinates me because who would think about that? Like, I wouldn't. Yes, I'm so glad. Okay, at this point, the authorities started looking at different handwritings of different males in the oblast, or the province. The police checked over 556,000 samples of handwriting. Can you imagine doing all of that tedious work? Oh my God, how do they not all just blur together at some point? There's no freaking way that I could do that. Well, eventually the police would find that Gennady Modestovich Mikhasevich's handwriting resembled that of the letter and the notes. After further investigation, it was revealed that there were other pieces of evidence that made it convincing that Gennady was indeed guilty. So Gennady was finally arrested in 1985, 14 and a half years after his first murder. When the police were hauling him away in front of his family, he turned to his wife and he said, quote, this is a mistake. I'll be right back, end quote. It was said at first he denied any involvement in the crimes. He actually came up with a terrible explanation that he told the authorities. It's funny, but not funny. He told them that he was kidnapped by two unknown men who took him to a deserted location and forced him to write the letter. What? It was at this point that Gennady knew that he was finished. Obviously, they're not going to believe. That's just, really, of all the things that you could go with, you're going with that? He finally broke down and confessed to the investigators. He then tried to get psychiatrists to declare him insane, but it didn't work out for him. Good old insanity plea. It said they found him to be sane, but one source did say that he was diagnosed with psychopathy. So we're going to go on a side note for just a second. I looked up what exactly that meant. I wanted to know because we hear the word psychopath and sociopath a lot, and I wanted to know a little bit more. So this is going to be a little bit of a side note, but I thought it was worth putting in here on this case since he was diagnosed with this. You don't hear this very often. Bear with me if it's a little bit confusing, but I'm going to do my best because it's fascinating and it's important to those of us who may have children that might have mental health issues or personality disorders or learning disorders or any variety of it. It might give us a little bit of insight on what we can look out for as far as a psychopathy diagnosis. I know as a parent, one of the biggest fears, at least for me and the people in my life, is that at some point we are curious that, for our kiddos who may be a little bit different, we're always wanting to make sure that we help them as much as possible so that they can be functioning members of society or a successful adult and not what we know in true crime to be a psychopath. I just want my kids to be the very best versions of themselves as they become adults. And I think there's a lot of other parents that feel that way. We all know that we can't always be there to help them with every decision. I'm speaking from experience as I have a son who has a few diagnoses. This is for any of us who are curious. Here we go. So I read in the APA.org article, which is the American Psychological Association, I read about psychopathy, that it's not actually a diagnostic category in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is abbreviated as DSM-V. I'm guessing the V is volume 5. I'm not 100% on this because it didn't really offer an explanation, but I'm just going to abbreviate it DSM. It said that one reason for not being a diagnostic category was because it's hard to hone in on a uniform definition of psychopathy, and also that it's underrated and underfunded. The other reason it's not is because there were earlier disagreements about this in the field. So some that were studying this disorder were concerned that a psychopathy diagnosis would stigmatize these people too much. This is just my opinion because when I was reading this, I was thinking, this makes sense to me, but this is just my opinion. So if somebody was diagnosed as a psychopath, it could potentially have some serious effects on their lives or potentially ruin their lives. Which is understandable. Like, I can imagine that if people were to find out that you were diagnosed as a psychopath, they may be afraid of you. They may be not wanting to get close to you. They may be, watching you carefully. And that's for the authorities. That's for your job. That's for your family. Like, I can imagine that this would be a problem. So the other side of this, people who were studying this, said that they had the concern that clinicians may have a difficult time accurately assessing the traits like callousness or cruelty, or even indifferent disregard of other people. So meaning like not caring about others in the least. Some clinicians may have a hard time diagnosing that. Even though psychopathy was included in the first 2 editions of the DSM, it was actually replaced in the 3rd version by ASPD, which is Antisocial Personality Disorder. And this one is super interesting. So this focused on the behavioral aspects of psychopathy, which were things like aggression, impulsivity, and the violation of other people's rights. In return, it only minimally focused on personality characteristics like callousness, remorselessness, and narcissism. So right now, the closest DSM diagnosis to psychopathy, which is aka being a psychopath, is a youth diagnosis of conduct disorder with an addition of quote-unquote callous, unemotional, which is abbreviated as CU, traits. And these traits manifest as lack of guilt, lack of remorse, a callous lack of empathy, a lack of concern about one's performance on important activities, and a general lack of emotional expression. This article was so fascinating. I got sucked into it immediately, and I read the entire thing. I won't explain it all on here, but I did want to say just a little bit more because the article said they talked about what drives psychopathy, but before I say that, I have to say, we've talked about in other episodes, and I've heard this a lot when it comes to true crime, that there are certain people who ended up being serial killers or psychopaths or that have the antisocial personality disorder, whatever, that have what people call like dead eyes, or they were able to switch certain things on or off when they were confessing, when they were interviewed. I find this so fascinating. I've always wanted to delve into more research for, the difference between a sociopath, a psychopath. This stuff fascinates me, especially when it comes to children, because there's many cases where I always wonder if we knew more about mental health back then and these children were allowed to get help or were able to get help or had resources to help them. Would things have turned out differently? Because the research is just phenomenal. I was reading the article about, the things that they're developing just to see if they can make a difference, like video games for kids that can teach them facial expressions, things like that for people who may not understand those things and struggle. I think it's super neat that they're trying to do these different things, and I just wanted you guys to know that it's a super awesome article and you should check it out. I'm going to have the sources in the description in case I'll do that every time in case you guys ever want to. Oh, so this is the little tidbit about what drives psychopathy. So the article went on to say that researchers are learning more and more about factors that may quote-unquote spur on psychopathy neurobiologically, genetically, environmentally, and behaviorally. So this has always been a big question to people, like, are they born this way or are they made this way? By factors like traumatic childhoods, etc., because we see this time and time again. So the article says that their research suggested that the warning signs for psychopathy are often presented early on. For example, they have had studies of thousands of preschoolers, school-aged kids, and juvenile offenders in the U.S. and other countries. They demonstrated that kids compared with youngsters who have conduct disorder alone, those with the added CU, in case you guys forgot, was the callous unemotional, they're more likely to demonstrate deficient emotional responding to fear and distress in others, which what they're saying is they may not react when someone else is scared or in distress. At least that's how I took it. And they may also have more severe and planned aggression, which was scary to me to think that these young kids could have planned aggression. Like, it's one thing if they just can't control their emotions. I mean, I know many adults who can't control their emotions, and yet we expect children to. And I see it even with my own children. And I know how that feels to let your emotions get the best of you. So to think that these are actually being planned is horrific. And I hope that these kids are able to get some help. These are the kind that are more likely to show aggressive and antisocial behavior as adults, including psychopathic traits. However, they did state that the kids were not destined to be psychopaths just because they have these factors, and in a vast majority of cases, they won't be. So he said that if you have a public health problem like psychopathy and you see these, early indicators for risk, it's critical to implement early interventions that are designed to prevent that outcome. Basically, if you see signs of things like this in your own children or in children in your life, the earlier you can get an intervention of, therapy or medicine or whatever you feel is necessary, or can do, whatever resources you have, that it could help their futures if they learn how to do and control and have tools to help them later on in life. I just wanted to include that little bit of information from the APA because I find the psychology behind everything, but especially in true crime, interesting. And since it's not super common that someone, even a murderer, is diagnosed with any kind of psychopathy, it was just a perfect time to talk about what that meant. I went down a huge rabbit hole with this, especially with my own children, because I'm that mom, and it was super interesting. So now we're going to get back to Gennady. So he led the investigators to the place where some of the victims' belongings were that he had hidden. It said that he actually seemed smug and without remorse during his confession. It also said that Gennady was actually excited with the thought that his confession tape would gain him national notoriety, which makes me absolutely sick. I hate it when people do horrific things to other people for notoriety, or that they're happy that they're going to be famous for their awful acts. We see this all the time. It's absolutely disgusting. I hope that they figure out these kind of people early on and they can get help so that they don't do these, because there's a lot of other ways to get notoriety. There's a lot of other ways to become famous. There's a lot of other ways for people to know your names. Let's do some kind acts for once and let's find out how far that'll take you. He said, quote, "This tape will be all over the Soviet Union. People will be trying to see what kind of man I was." Well, joke's on him, because the tape was never shown to the general audience. Gennady ended up confessing to murdering 43 women, but it's said that he may have actually murdered more, like 55 or more than that. It was said that when Gennady was confessing, he actually told the investigators that although he sexually assaulted or raped his victims, he got the most satisfaction by killing them. Gross. By the time Gennady was arrested, there had already been 14 people who were convicted of his crimes. We mentioned this earlier. Now we're getting back into it. This part is just so sad. Most of these people had been unfortunately forced to confess by means of torture, and that at least one of them had been sentenced and executed for crimes they didn't even commit, which is just absolutely awful and sickening and so unfair. During the trial, it was said that Gennady was calm and, quote, utterly without regret, and that the only time he shed a tear during the entire trial was when they talked about his first love, Elena. Throughout all of the court proceedings, it was said that Gennady was protected by KGB agents who feared that he would be assassinated not just by one of the victim's family members that may be feeling quite vengeful, but also by police officers who had tortured innocent people into taking the fall for his murders, which that's no good. Like, that's the cops' fault, which to me doesn't make any sense, because even though he's disgusting and awful and I would want to watch this man be put down for sure, it's not really his fault that the police didn't do their jobs correctly in this case and made people confess to things that they didn't actually do. That seems kind of like misplaced guilt to me. Anyways, Gennady was sentenced to death and was executed by firing squad in 1987. Good. I'm glad that he was killed, although I understand why some people are against the death penalty for either thinking they don't always deserve it, or some people think that death is not enough. But to me, I don't think torturing him would make him all of a sudden feel empathy, where he clearly has none. But what I like is the thought that maybe he was scared. Maybe he knew it was coming. Maybe he was upset that he was about to die, and that in itself is some kind of torture. I don't know. I know that that's important to some people, and I get that. If there was ever a chance for someone to escape from jail or custody and go do this again, I'm like, put them down now, because I know that the life sentence is what it is, but there are just some people, in my opinion, that should just be put down so that never happens, that there is no chance for them to get back out no matter what. So many of the officials were dismissed from their posts, which means they were fired because of this case, which doesn't seem to be a fair punishment for what they did to those poor innocent people, but all right. And it said that only one of the police officers were prosecuted from abusing his power and was sentenced to only 4 years in prison. So yeah, that is the awful, brutal, sickening story of Gennady Modestovich Mikhasevich killing spree that lasted 14 years. This case was an interesting one to me because of the police side of things. I understand that DNA wasn't what it is now, like back then, and it probably made so many of these mysteries hard to solve. But the mere fact that the police were allowed to torture people for information is just insane to me. Okay, this is my opinion, and low-key, I've always thought that the authorities should be allowed to torture people to get information out of them. Please don't come for me. In my mind, I always thought that if the authorities could torture someone just a little bit to get information out, like where a bomb is hidden or where a victim may still be alive, things like that it would be worth that little bit of torture, right? But now I'm thinking I'm completely wrong. And clearly this is the other side to that, where people confess to things that they didn't even do. They're prosecuted for it, they're sentenced for those false confessions, and then they're put to death for stuff they didn't even do. Can you imagine being one of those people who just buckled and confessed to crimes that they didn't even commit just to stop the torture, then to find out that they were going to be executed for that momentary lapse in judgment because the torture they were receiving was just too much? It's absolutely heartbreaking. So I'm going to always try and post pictures from the cases that I talk about on the Kill File socials, so you can put a face to these stories. I'm always curious to know what they look like myself, and if they look like what you pictured in your mind, because, you know, when you listen to somebody or talk to somebody on the phone or whatever, and you hear a story, you create this image in your mind, and then you see a picture of them, and you're like, oh my god, it's so much different than I thought. I usually thought it would be this or that. I always find that I'm disappointed. Always. I don't know why in my head they're always monsters and these, like, glorified, awful people, but they're not. They're just regular people. I don't know, in my head it's just so much different. Maybe it means I have a great imagination. I don't know. I'm rambling. Anyways, check out Gennady's picture and let me know who you think he looks like. He reminds me of a celebrity that's really famous, and I'm curious to see if any of you guys agree or think so as well. When I asked my husband, he named the same actor, which is sad, and I don't want to say their name on here, but I want to know in the comments who you think he looks like. I will see you guys next time. Bye. Well, that's it for today, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today and listening to another episode of The Kill File. If you want to share your thoughts on what we covered today, suggest a case for me to check out, or if you're just bored and looking for something to do, you can head over to The Kill File's social medias and reach out. We're on Facebook and Instagram as The Kill File, and we're on YouTube and TikTok as The Kill File Podcast. Also, feel free to check out our website at thekillfile.com, where you can learn more about me, your host, and a little bit more about how The Kill File got started. I love hearing from you guys. Come back on Mondays, wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, when we will cover another case on The Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye!